July 19, 1952, 11:40 p.m., Washington National Airport. Air traffic controller Edward Nugent stared at his radar scope and laughed. 7 blips were dancing across his screen at impossible speeds, right over the White House. "Equipment malfunction," he muttered. Then another radar station called. They saw them too. Then another. Then a pilot radioed in, his voice shaking. "I see lights, glowing orange. They're following me." Nugent stopped laughing. Within minutes, Air Force jets screamed toward the Capitol. The objects vanished. When the fighters left, they returned. For 2 weekends, something owned the skies over America's capital. The military scrambled. The president demanded answers. And what happened next would be buried in classified files for decades. This is the night the impossible became undeniable. This is the Washington UFO Incident of 1952. The air conditioning hummed softly in the radar room at Washington National Airport as Edward Nugent settled into his chair for another routine midnight shift. It was July 19, 1952, a Saturday night bleeding into Sunday morning, and the 27-year-old air traffic controller expected nothing more exciting than guiding a few late commercial flights to their gates. The Korean War raged thousands of miles away, but here in the heart of America's capital, peace reigned. The most powerful military on Earth stood guard, and the summer sky belonged to scheduled airlines and the occasional military transport. Nugent had been tracking aircraft for 3 years. He knew his equipment intimately, understood how weather could create false returns, could distinguish between a B-29 bomber and a DC-6 airliner by radar signature alone. He'd seen temperature inversions, ground clutter, equipment glitches, every trick that radar could play on an inexperienced operator. But what appeared on his scope at 11:40 p.m. was something else entirely. 7 objects materialized on his screen, scattered across the airspace south of Washington. At first glance, they resembled ordinary aircraft returns, bright blips moving steadily across the green phosphorescent display. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. These weren't following any known flight paths. They weren't behaving like aircraft at all. Nugent leaned closer, his trained eyes tracking the object's movements. One blip accelerated from a crawl to what his scope indicated was over 7,000 miles per hour in seconds. Another stopped completely, hovering motionless in restricted airspace. A third executed a right-angled turn at high speed, a maneuver that would kill any human pilot through sheer G-force. His first instinct was to laugh. Equipment malfunction had to be. Modern radar was reliable but not perfect. He'd file a maintenance report in the morning. Then his telephone rang. It was the radar room at nearby Andrews Air Force Base, home to the aircraft that transported the president. Their senior controller's voice was tight with tension. "Nugent, are you picking up anything unusual? We've got unknown targets all over our scope. They're not responding to radio calls, not filing flight plans, and they're moving like nothing I've ever seen." The laughter died in Nugent's throat. 2 separate radar installations miles apart, seeing the same impossible objects. This wasn't equipment failure. This was real. Senior air traffic controller Harry Barnes, a 20-year veteran who'd guided aircraft through the chaos of wartime operations, arrived at Nugent's shoulder. Barnes was not a man prone to panic or wild speculation. He'd seen every type of aircraft the military operated, had tracked experimental jets, had watched countless radar contacts come and go. He studied the scope in silence, his jaw tightening as the objects continued their impossible dance across restricted airspace. "Call Andrews again," Barnes ordered quietly. "Get exact positions. If we're all seeing the same thing, we need to know right now." Within minutes, the confirmation came. Not just 2 radar stations, but 3. Washington National, Andrews Air Force Base, and a radar installation at Bolling Air Force Base all tracked identical targets in identical positions. The objects were real, solid, and they were violating the most restricted airspace in the United States. At 12:30 a.m., one of the objects drifted slowly across the Potomac River and positioned itself directly over the White House. It hung there, motionless, for several minutes. Then it moved to the Capitol building, then to the Pentagon. Methodically, deliberately, as if conducting a survey of America's seat of power. Barnes felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. Whatever these things were, they weren't lost. They knew exactly where they were going. Capital Airlines Flight 807, approaching Washington for landing, suddenly broke radio silence. Captain S.C. Pierman's voice crackled through the speaker, professional training barely masking his confusion. "Tower, I have visual contact with 6 bright lights. They're not aircraft. I don't know what they are. Orange-white, very bright, moving in formation off my right wing." Nugent's hands trembled slightly as he keyed his microphone. The objects on his scope matched the pilot's position exactly. This wasn't radar ghosts or equipment failure. Trained pilots were seeing them with their own eyes. Whatever was flying over Washington that night was visible, trackable, and completely unknown. Barnes picked up the red telephone connecting directly to Air Force Command. His voice was steady, professional, but his knuckles were white as he gripped the receiver. "This is Washington National Control. We have a situation. You need to scramble interceptors immediately. We have multiple unknown aircraft over restricted airspace, and they're not responding to any radio contact." The comfortable certainty of post-war American air superiority was about to face its first real challenge. And as those glowing objects continued their leisurely patrol over the nation's capital, every man in that radar room understood they were witnessing something that would change everything. The laughter had stopped. The impossible had arrived, and it was only the beginning. The scramble order reached the 142nd Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware at 12:45 a.m. 2 F-94 Starfire jets, equipped with the most advanced radar systems in the American arsenal, thundered down the runway within minutes. Their mission was simple: intercept and identify the unknown aircraft violating Washington's restricted airspace. What should have been a routine interception would become one of the most frustrating pursuits in military aviation history. Lieutenant William Patterson, leading the intercept, pushed his Starfire to maximum speed as he approached Washington. Ground control vectored him toward the nearest target, providing continuous updates on position and heading. Patterson's onboard radar operator confirmed visual contact on their scope. The object was there, solid and real, exactly where the ground controllers said it would be. Patterson locked on and began his approach, confident he'd have visual identification within seconds. Then the object vanished. Not gradually, not by climbing or diving out of sight. It simply disappeared, as if someone had flipped a switch. Patterson's radar showed empty sky. The ground controllers at Washington National watched their scope in disbelief as the target blinked out of existence the moment the fighter closed within 5 miles. "Where did it go?" Patterson demanded over the radio, banking hard and searching the darkness. "Tower, I had solid contact and now there's nothing. These things aren't just fast, they're aware we're coming." At Andrews Air Force Base, radar operator Staff Sergeant Charles Davenport watched the pattern repeat itself across his scope. Every time fighters approached, the objects scattered like startled birds, accelerating to speeds that should have torn any aircraft apart. When the fighters exhausted their fuel and turned for home, the objects returned, resuming their methodical patrol over Washington's most sensitive locations. It was as if they were playing a game, demonstrating their complete superiority over America's best interceptors, but not all the objects fled. At 1:30 a.m., Patterson spotted something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A glowing orange sphere materialized off his right wing, pacing his Starfire at 450 miles per hour. It maintained perfect formation, matching every turn, every climb, every dive. Patterson's radar operator confirmed it was tracking them on scope. The object was real, solid, and impossibly close. "It's right there," Patterson radioed, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and awe. "Maybe 200 feet off my wing. Glowing orange-white, spherical, no visible means of propulsion. It's following us." He tried to close the distance, banking toward the object. It accelerated away instantly, reaching what ground radar calculated as 7,200 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds. The G-forces from such acceleration should have liquefied any human pilot. Yet the object maneuvered with casual ease before vanishing into the night sky. The chaos in the radar room at Washington National had transformed into something approaching panic. Harry Barnes, the unflappable senior controller, found himself coordinating reports from multiple sources that defied everything he understood about aviation. Commercial airline pilots were calling in visual sightings. Military observers at Andrews reported lights maneuvering over the base. The radar scopes at 3 separate installations showed identical tracks, and nothing, absolutely nothing in the American military arsenal could catch them. At 2:15 a.m., the situation escalated beyond anyone's worst fears. A cluster of objects, 7 in total, positioned themselves in a perfect circle directly over the White House. They hung there, motionless, for nearly 10 minutes. Every radar station tracked them. Multiple ground observers, including Air Force security personnel at nearby installations, confirmed visual contact. The objects were hovering over the home of the President of the United States, and there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do about it. Major Dewey Fournette, a Pentagon liaison officer and Project Blue Book investigator, who happened to be in the Washington National Tower that night, watched the display with growing dread. Fournette was no stranger to UFO reports. He'd investigated hundreds of sightings, dismissed most as misidentifications or natural phenomena. But this was different. These weren't distant lights seen by untrained observers. These were solid radar returns confirmed by multiple independent systems, visual sightings by experienced pilots and controllers, and behavior that suggested intelligence and deliberate action. "This isn't equipment malfunction," Fournette said quietly to Barnes, his eyes never leaving the radar scope. "This isn't weather. These things are real, they're solid, and they're demonstrating capabilities that shouldn't exist. We need to document everything. Every radar track, every visual sighting, every radio transmission. Whatever happens, we need proof of what we're seeing tonight." By 3 a.m., the object's behavior shifted again. They began accelerating and decelerating in patterns that seemed almost playful, as if demonstrating their capabilities for the observers below. One object paced a commercial airliner for several minutes before shooting straight up and disappearing from radar range. Another descended to less than 1,000 feet over the Potomac River, close enough that witnesses on the ground reported seeing details. A glowing disc-shaped craft with no visible wings, engines or means of propulsion. As dawn approached, the objects gradually withdrew. One by one, they accelerated to impossible speeds and vanished from the radar scopes, leaving behind a room full of trained professionals who no longer trusted their understanding of what was possible. The last object departed at 5:30 a.m., streaking away at a calculated speed of over 8,000 miles per hour. Harry Barnes sat in exhausted silence, staring at his now empty radar scope. In 6 hours, everything he believed about aviation and aerial phenomena had been demolished. The objects had demonstrated awareness, intelligence, and technological capabilities that exceeded anything in the American or Soviet arsenal by orders of magnitude. And they had done it with casual ease, as if the most powerful military on Earth was nothing more than an interesting curiosity. Patterson's Starfire touched down at Newcastle just as the sun rose over Washington. His hands still trembled as he climbed from the cockpit. Ground crew noticed his ashen face, the way he kept looking at the sky as if expecting the objects to return. When the intelligence officer asked him what he'd seen, Patterson's response was simple and devastating. Something that shouldn't exist. And it knew we were there. The longest night in Washington air traffic control history had ended, but the nightmare was just beginning. Because in 7 days they would return. By Sunday afternoon, July 20th, the secret was already leaking. Air traffic controllers couldn't stop talking. Pilots shared their experiences in airport lounges. Military personnel whispered in the Pentagon's corridors. And by Monday morning, reporters who maintained contacts inside Washington National Airport began making phone calls. What the military had hoped to contain quietly was about to explode across every newspaper in America. The Washington Post broke the story first. "Interceptors chase flying saucers over Washington," screamed the headline on Tuesday, July 22nd. The article, carefully worded to avoid appearing sensational, nevertheless conveyed the impossible truth. Unknown objects had violated the capital's airspace for hours, outmaneuvered military interceptors, and hovered over the White House itself. Within hours, every major newspaper in the country picked up the story. The New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times all ran front-page coverage of what was being called the most significant UFO incident in American history. For a nation already on edge, the timing couldn't have been worse. American soldiers were dying in Korea, facing an enemy that had proven more formidable than anyone expected. The Soviet Union had detonated its first hydrogen bomb just months earlier, shattering America's nuclear monopoly. Civil defense drills had schoolchildren hiding under desks, preparing for atomic annihilation. And now something unknown was flying over Washington with complete impunity, demonstrating technology that made America's military seem primitive by comparison. The Pentagon's initial response was disaster compounded by confusion. The first official statement, released Tuesday afternoon, dismissed the entire incident as routine radar anomalies caused by temperature inversions. But the explanation satisfied no one. Temperature inversions couldn't explain visual sightings by experienced pilots. They couldn't account for solid radar returns on 3 separate installations simultaneously. And they certainly couldn't explain objects that fled when interceptors approached, then returned when the fighters departed. Edward Nugent found himself besieged by reporters. Against orders, he spoke to several, carefully describing what he'd witnessed. "I've been tracking aircraft for 3 years," he told a Washington Star reporter. "I know what weather looks like on radar. I know what equipment malfunctions look like." These were solid objects, maneuvering intelligently and moving at speeds that shouldn't be possible. You can call it whatever you want, but those things were real. Harry Barnes went further, speaking on the record despite knowing it would end his relationship with military authorities. "In my professional opinion as a senior air traffic controller with 20 years of experience, we tracked objects of unknown origin performing maneuvers that exceed any known aircraft capabilities. The temperature inversion explanation is inadequate and does not account for the observed phenomena." His statement, printed in newspapers nationwide, gave credibility to what many wanted to dismiss as hysteria. The public reaction split along predictable lines. Those who'd followed UFO reports for years saw the Washington incident as validation, proof that something truly extraordinary was visiting Earth. Skeptics pointed to the lack of photographic evidence, the confusion of the night, the possibility that trained observers had misinterpreted mundane phenomena under stressful conditions. But millions of ordinary Americans simply felt fear. If unknown craft could hover over the White House untouchable, what did that say about American security? What did it mean for their safety? The calls flooded into congressional offices. Constituents demanded answers, protection, explanation. Senator Brian McMahon of Connecticut, chairman of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, publicly called for a full investigation. "If these objects are real," he stated on the Senate floor, "we need to know what they are and where they come from. If they're not real, we need to explain why trained military personnel and experienced pilots are reporting them. Either way, the American people deserve the truth, but the truth was something the military didn't possess." In conference rooms at the Pentagon, senior officers grappled with possibilities that ranged from the unlikely to the terrifying. For these Soviet aircraft using captured German technology, the Soviets had seized enormous amounts of advanced German research at the end of World War II, including work on disc-shaped aircraft and exotic propulsion systems. But the capabilities demonstrated over Washington exceeded anything the Germans had even theorized. Could the Soviets have advanced that far, that fast, in complete secrecy? The alternative explanations were worse. If these weren't Soviet aircraft, if they weren't American experimental craft operating without proper authorization, if they weren't some elaborate hoax or mass delusion, then what were they? The possibility that hung unspoken in every classified briefing was the one that no one wanted to voice, that these objects were of non-human origin, demonstrating technology centuries or millennia beyond human capability. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO investigation program, scrambled to make sense of the Washington incident. Captain Edward Ruppelt, the program's director, found himself overwhelmed by reports flooding in from across the country. The Washington sightings had triggered a wave of UFO reports nationwide. Citizens who'd remained silent about their own experiences now came forward, emboldened by the fact that even the capital's air defenses had been helpless against the unknown visitors. The psychological impact rippled through the military. Fighter pilots who'd spent years training to defend American airspace had watched helplessly as unknown objects demonstrated complete superiority. They'd been outrun, outmaneuvered, and essentially ignored by craft that treated America's best interceptors like annoying insects. The blow to military morale was severe, though carefully hidden from the public. In squadron ready rooms across the country, pilots asked each other the question that had no good answer. If we can't stop them, what's the point? Intelligence analysts at the CIA took particular interest. If these were Soviet aircraft, the implications were catastrophic. It would mean the Soviets possessed technology that rendered American air defenses obsolete, that they could strike anywhere at will, that the balance of power had shifted so dramatically that American security was an illusion. Emergency meetings were convened, contingency plans were drafted, and quietly, very quietly, some analysts began considering the possibility that the objects weren't Soviet at all. By Friday, July 25th, the story dominated American conversation. Newspaper editorials debated the reality of flying saucers. Radio programs featured experts and witnesses. In small towns and big cities, Americans looked at the sky differently, wondering if they might glimpse what had been seen over Washington. The incident had transformed from military concern to cultural phenomenon, and the military was losing control of the narrative. Then came the reports from radar operators at Washington National and Andrews Air Force Base. The objects were coming back. Early Saturday evening, July 26th, the scopes began showing the first returns, scattered at first, then more numerous. The same impossible speeds, the same intelligent maneuvering, the same disregard for American airspace restrictions. They'd returned, and this time the whole world would be watching. Saturday, July 26, 1952, exactly 1 week after the first incident. As darkness fell over Washington, Harry Barnes arrived at the radar room at Washington National Airport with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. He'd spent the week being interviewed, questioned, and quietly warned by military brass to keep his observations to himself. But tonight, he'd volunteered for the midnight shift. Something told him they would return. He was right. At 8:15 p.m., while daylight still painted the sky, the first blip appeared on the scope. Then another. Then 5 more. Within 20 minutes, Barnes was tracking over a dozen unknown objects scattered across Washington's airspace. This time, there would be no confusion, no initial laughter, no dismissing it as equipment malfunction. Barnes immediately contacted Andrews Air Force Base and Bolling Air Force Base. Both installations confirmed identical tracks. The objects had returned, and they'd brought reinforcements. The difference this Saturday night was preparation. Major Dewey Fournay had ensured that multiple Air Force officers were present in the radar room. Newspaper reporters, tipped off by sources inside the tower, had stationed themselves at vantage points around the city. Commercial airline pilots had been briefed to report any visual sightings immediately. If the objects returned, there would be documentation, witnesses, and undeniable proof. The objects seemed almost obliging, performing for their audience with even greater brazenness than before. At 9:30 p.m., Capital Airlines Flight 610, piloted by Captain William Bruin, made visual contact with the objects while approaching Washington. His radio transmission, recorded and later released to the press, captured the moment perfectly. "Tower, I have multiple lights in sight. They're orange, very bright, moving erratically at high speed. I count at least 7 distinct objects. They're definitely not conventional aircraft. One just accelerated from a standstill to what must be thousands of miles per hour. I've never seen anything move like that." Barnes vectored Bruin's aircraft closer to the objects for better observation. What the pilot described sent chills through everyone listening. The objects appeared to be solid, disc-shaped craft, glowing with an orange-white luminescence that pulsed rhythmically. They moved in formations, then broke apart and reformed in different patterns. Some hovered motionless for minutes before shooting away at impossible velocities. Others performed maneuvers that defied physics. Right-angle turns at high speed, instantaneous reversals of direction, accelerations that should have generated sonic booms but produced no sound at all. At 10:30 p.m., the Air Force scrambled interceptors from Newcastle Air Force Base again. This time they sent 4 F-94 Starfires instead of 2, determined to box in at least one of the objects. Lieutenant William Patterson, who'd encountered the objects the previous weekend, led the formation. His experience from the first incident made him the closest thing the Air Force had to an expert on these unknown visitors. Patterson's approach was more cautious this time. Instead of diving directly at the nearest target, he positioned his flight to intercept from multiple angles simultaneously. For a few moments, the tactic seemed to work. 4 jets converged on a cluster of 3 objects hovering near the Capitol building. Then, as if responding to a signal, all 3 objects accelerated vertically at what ground radar calculated as 9,000 miles per hour, vanishing from both visual and radar contact in seconds. "They're toying with us," Patterson reported, frustration evident in his voice. "Every time we get close, they demonstrate they can leave whenever they want. It's like they're showing us how outmatched we are." He wasn't wrong. The object's behavior suggested not just technological superiority, but tactical awareness and possibly amusement at the humans' futile attempts at interception. Then, at 11:45 p.m., something extraordinary happened. As Patterson's flight circled over Washington, low on fuel and preparing to return to base, he found himself surrounded. 4 objects materialized around his starfire, positioning themselves at his 12, 3, 6, and 9 o'clock positions. They maintained perfect formation with his aircraft, matching his speed exactly. Patterson's radar operator confirmed solid returns from all 4 objects. They were close, less than 500 feet away. "I'm surrounded," Patterson transmitted, and for the first time real fear crept into his professional pilot's voice. 4 objects holding position around my aircraft. They're glowing orange-white, clearly visible. My radar operator confirms contact on all 4. "Request instructions." The tower fell silent. What instructions could they give? Fire on objects that had demonstrated they could outmaneuver anything in the sky? Try to evade craft that could accelerate to thousands of miles per hour instantly? Patterson was alone, surrounded by the unknown with no defensive options. For 3 long minutes the objects paced Patterson's starfire. He could see them clearly through his canopy, glowing spheres that illuminated the night sky. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were gone. All 4 objects accelerated away simultaneously, their departures so rapid that Patterson's radar operator couldn't track their exit vectors. They simply vanished, leaving the shaken pilot alone in the night sky. In the Washington National Tower, Major Fournet had been documenting every moment. He'd watched on radar as the objects surrounded Patterson's aircraft. He'd listened to the pilot's frightened transmissions, and he'd come to a conclusion that he knew would make him a target for ridicule and career damage. These objects were real, they were intelligently controlled, and they were demonstrating capabilities that exceeded human technology by such a margin that comparisons were meaningless. At 12:30 a.m., senior military brass arrived at the tower, including Major General John Samford, the Air Force Director of Intelligence. Samford needed to see the phenomenon for himself, to understand what was causing such chaos. He stood beside Barnes, watching the radar scope in silence as objects danced across the screen, their movements precise and deliberate. When a cluster of objects positioned themselves directly over the White House again, Samford's expression hardened. This was no longer just a military curiosity. This was a national security crisis. Throughout the night, commercial pilots continued reporting visual sightings. National Airlines, Capital Airlines, Pan American, all had crews observing the objects. Some pilots descended to give their passengers a better view, circling around the glowing craft, while travelers pressed their faces to windows, witnessing history. The objects seemed unconcerned by the attention, continuing their systematic patrol of Washington's most sensitive locations. By 3 a.m., the tower had logged over 60 separate radar tracks, dozens of visual confirmations from multiple witnesses, and countless photographs from civilians and military personnel. The objects had been present for nearly 7 hours, far longer than the first incident. They demonstrated even more impressive capabilities, surrounded a military interceptor, and hovered over the White House multiple times. And there wasn't a single thing the most powerful military on Earth could do about it. As dawn broke over Washington on Sunday, July 27th, the objects departed one final time. They accelerated away in different directions, their radar returns fading as they reached speeds the equipment couldn't track. Patterson landed at Newcastle exhausted, traumatized, and forever changed by what he'd experienced. In the tower, Major General Samford stood quietly, knowing that by Monday morning he'd be facing the largest press conference since World War II. The objects had returned. They'd performed for witnesses, buzzed the nation's capital, and demonstrated complete dominance over American airspace. And now, the military had to explain to a terrified nation what it meant, even though they had no idea themselves. Captain Edward J. Ruppelt landed at Washington National Airport on Monday morning, July 28th, exhausted from a sleepless flight from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. As director of Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO investigation program, Ruppelt had spent 2 years collecting and analyzing reports of unidentified flying objects. He'd investigated hundreds of cases, dismissing most as misidentifications of conventional aircraft, weather balloons, or astronomical phenomena. But the Washington incidents were different. These weren't distant lights seen by unreliable witnesses. These were multiple radar confirmations. Experienced pilots and military personnel, all reporting the same impossible objects over 2 separate weekends. Ruppelt's first stop was the radar room at Washington National. Harry Barnes greeted him with a thick folder containing radar plots, pilot reports, and witness statements from both incidents. The documentation was extensive, professional, and deeply troubling. Barnes walked Ruppelt through the events hour by hour, showing him the radar tracks that demonstrated speeds exceeding 7,000 miles per hour, the patterns that suggested intelligent control, and the consistent behavior across both weekends. "Captain, I've been doing this for 20 years, Barnes said, his voice steady but strained. "I know my equipment. I know what weather looks like on radar." These were solid objects, and they knew we were watching them. The way they responded to our interceptors, the way they positioned themselves over specific buildings, that wasn't random. That was deliberate. Ruppelt took careful notes, but his expression betrayed his concern. This wasn't going to be easy to explain away. At the Pentagon, Ruppelt attended a series of increasingly tense meetings with Air Force intelligence officers, scientists from the Air Technical Intelligence Center, and senior military brass scrambling to develop an official explanation. The political pressure was immense. President Truman had personally called Air Force Chief of Staff General Hoyt Vandenberg, demanding answers. Congress was preparing hearings. The press was relentless, and the American people were terrified that their capital's defenses had been exposed as utterly inadequate. The scientists proposed multiple theories, each more desperate than the last. Could the radar returns have been caused by temperature inversions, atmospheric conditions where layers of warm air trapped beneath cold air created false radar echoes? Dr. Howard Lorenzen from the Naval Research Laboratory championed this explanation. He presented data showing that temperature inversions had been present over Washington on both nights, and that such conditions could theoretically create radar anomalies. But the theory had critical problems that the scientists couldn't adequately address. Temperature inversions occurred frequently in Washington, particularly during summer, yet these radar returns had never been observed before. More significantly, temperature inversions couldn't explain the visual sightings. Over a dozen experienced pilots had observed glowing objects with their own eyes, describing solid, disc-shaped craft that maneuvered intelligently. Lieutenant Patterson had been surrounded by 4 objects that his radar operator confirmed as solid returns, while Patterson simultaneously observed them visually. No atmospheric phenomenon could account for that correlation. Major Dewey Fournette, who'd witnessed both incidents from the Washington National Tower, objected strenuously to the temperature inversion explanation. In a classified memo that wouldn't be declassified for decades, Fournette wrote, "The objects demonstrated awareness of our interceptors, fleeing when fighters approached and returning when they departed. They maintained formation flight, hovered over specific targets, and performed maneuvers that indicated intelligent control. Temperature inversions do not exhibit evasive behavior. They do not surround military aircraft. They do not systematically patrol the White House and Capitol building." Ruppelt found himself caught between scientific skepticism and overwhelming evidence. His training told him to seek conventional explanations, to exhaust every mundane possibility before considering the extraordinary. But the Washington incidents defied conventional explanation. He interviewed the radar operators, all experienced professionals who insisted their equipment had been functioning normally. He spoke with the pilots, trained observers who'd logged thousands of flight hours and knew the difference between stars, weather balloons, and something genuinely unknown. He reviewed the radar plots, which showed objects accelerating, decelerating, hovering, and maneuvering in ways that no known aircraft could match. The radar data was particularly compelling. At Washington National, the radar system used was an AN/CPS-5, a state-of-the-art system that had been calibrated and tested just days before the incidents. Andrews Air Force Base used an AN/MPS-5, a different system that nevertheless tracked identical targets simultaneously. The probability that two different radar systems would malfunction identically at the same time, tracking the same false targets, was astronomically small. Yet accepting the alternative, that the returns represented real objects with extraordinary capabilities, meant acknowledging something that had profound implications for national security and humanity's place in the universe. Intelligence analysts proposed another disturbing possibility: Soviet intrusion. Perhaps the Soviets had developed advanced aircraft using captured German technology. The Nazis had experimented with disc-shaped aircraft designs, jet propulsion, and exotic aerodynamics. Could the Soviets have perfected these concepts in secret? The timing seemed suspicious. Korea was consuming American military attention. Perhaps this was a reconnaissance mission, the Soviets testing American air defenses by buzzing the capital with advanced aircraft to gauge response capabilities. But this theory collapsed under scrutiny. The object's performance exceeded any plausible advancement of 1940s German technology, speeds approaching 10,000 miles per hour, instantaneous acceleration, right-angle turns at high velocity. These capabilities suggested not incremental advancement, but revolutionary breakthroughs in physics and engineering. If the Soviets possessed such technology, they wouldn't need to wage conventional war in Korea. They could dominate American airspace at will, rendering the Strategic Air Command's bomber fleet obsolete and America's nuclear deterrent meaningless. CIA analysts studying the incident reached their own troubling conclusions. A classified assessment marked Top Secret concluded that the object's capabilities suggested technology far in advance of anything currently possessed by the United States or, based on available intelligence, the Soviet Union. The memo carefully avoided speculation about the object's origin, but the implications were clear. If these weren't American and weren't Soviet, the remaining explanations were either unknown terrestrial actors or non-terrestrial intelligence. By Tuesday afternoon, July 29th, the situation had reached critical mass. Newspaper editorials demanded answers. Radio commentators speculated wildly about Soviet superweapons and alien invasions. Congressional offices were flooded with constituent calls demanding government action. The military's credibility was at stake. Public confidence in American air defenses was collapsing, and the longer the Air Force remained silent, the worse the situation became. Major General John Samford, who'd witnessed the second incident firsthand, made the decision to hold a press conference. It would be the largest Pentagon press gathering since World War II, with over 200 reporters expected to attend. Samford knew his task: provide an explanation that would calm public fears, restore confidence in the military, and close the door on speculation about Soviet superweapons or extraterrestrial visitors. The problem was that he didn't have a credible explanation that satisfied all the evidence. Ruppelt, preparing briefing materials for Samford, felt increasingly conflicted. He'd built his career on scientific skepticism, on finding rational explanations for seemingly extraordinary events. But the Washington incidents challenged everything he thought he knew. The evidence was overwhelming, documented by multiple independent sources, confirmed by trained observers using sophisticated equipment. Yet the explanation that best fit the facts, that unknown objects with extraordinary capabilities had violated American airspace with impunity, was the one explanation he couldn't officially acknowledge. On Wednesday morning, as reporters assembled in the Pentagon's largest briefing room, Samford reviewed his prepared statement one final time. The official explanation would be temperature inversions, despite its flaws, despite the objections from witnesses, despite the correlation between radar returns and visual sightings. It was the only explanation that avoided acknowledging either Soviet technological superiority or something even more disturbing. The truth, whatever it was, would remain classified, but Ruppelt knew something that Samford's press conference wouldn't address: In his briefcase were reports from radar operators, pilot testimonies, and technical analyses that contradicted the official narrative. Someday these documents would be declassified. Someday the public would see what really happened over Washington in July 1952. Until then, the greatest aerial mystery in American history would be buried under the convenient fiction of weather phenomena and misidentified stars. The cover-up was about to begin, and it would last for decades. Wednesday, July 29, 1952, 4 Gullis p.m. The Pentagon's room 3E869 was packed beyond capacity. Over 200 reporters jostled for position, their cameras and notepads ready. Newsreel cameras lined the back wall, radio microphones clustered on the podium. This was the largest press conference held at the Pentagon since the end of World War II, and every major news organization in America had sent their best people. The questions they wanted answered were simple. What flew over Washington? Why couldn't the military stop it? And was America still safe? Major General John Samford entered the room precisely on time, his uniform immaculate, his expression carefully neutral. Flanking him were Major General Roger Ramey, Operations Director of the Air Defense Command, and Captain Roy James, a naval radar specialist. The assembled brain trust of military aviation was there to explain the unexplainable, to calm a nation teetering on the edge of panic. Samford's opening statement was a masterpiece of careful language, acknowledging just enough to seem forthright, while steering firmly toward the predetermined conclusion. Gentlemen, I'm here to discuss the recent radar trackings and visual sightings reported in the Washington area. First, let me be clear. We take these reports seriously. The Air Force has conducted a thorough investigation involving our best radar technicians, meteorologists, and intelligence analysts. He paused, allowing the reporters to settle. The room fell silent, except for the whirring of newsreel cameras. Our investigation has determined that the radar returns observed on the nights of July 19th and July 26th were caused by a meteorological phenomenon known as temperature inversion. When a layer of warm air sits above cooler air near the ground, it can create atmospheric conditions that cause radar beams to bend and reflect off objects on the ground, buildings, vehicles, even automobiles on highways. These ground returns can appear on radar scopes as airborne targets. The explanation sounded plausible, technical, authoritative, but the reporters weren't satisfied. The first question came immediately. General, how do you explain the visual sightings by experienced pilots? Temperature inversions aren't visible to the naked eye. Samford was ready. The visual sightings can be attributed to stars, particularly bright planets like Venus and Jupiter, which were visible in the sky during those nights. Under certain atmospheric conditions, stars can appear to move, shimmer, and even change color. Combined with the expectation created by the radar contacts, it's understandable that observers might interpret these astronomical objects as something extraordinary. But the follow-up questions came rapid fire, each one probing the weaknesses in his explanation. General, Lieutenant Patterson reported being surrounded by 4 objects that appeared simultaneously on his radar and were visible to him through his canopy. How does temperature inversion explain radar contacts and visual sightings occurring in the same location at the same time? Samford's composure never wavered. The coincidence of radar contacts and visual reports doesn't necessarily indicate a causal relationship. The pilot's attention was directed to that area of the sky by the radar operator's report. Once looking in that direction, he observed stars or other atmospheric phenomena that he interpreted as the radar targets. The human mind naturally seeks to connect separate stimuli into a coherent explanation. Another reporter pressed harder. General, Harry Barnes, the senior air traffic controller at Washington National, has 20 years of experience. He stated publicly that these were solid objects, not weather phenomena. He says he's tracked thousands of aircraft and knows the difference between real targets and atmospheric anomalies. Are you saying he's mistaken? This was the dangerous moment. Contradicting experienced professionals would undermine confidence in the very people who controlled America's airspace. Samford's response was diplomatic but firm. Mr. Barnes is an excellent controller, and I have great respect for his experience. However, even the most experienced observers can be fooled by unusual atmospheric conditions they haven't encountered before. Temperature inversions of this magnitude are rare, which is why the radar operators weren't immediately familiar with their signatures. Captain Roy James stepped forward to provide technical support. He described in detail how temperature inversions could create false radar returns, using charts and diagrams to illustrate the phenomenon. His presentation was polished, scientific, and deliberately complex. The technical jargon, the meteorological data, the radar physics all combined to create an impression of authoritative explanation. Most reporters lacking technical expertise found themselves unable to challenge the specifics effectively, but some journalists weren't buying it. A reporter from the Washington Post asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "General, if temperature inversions are a known phenomenon and they occur regularly over Washington, why haven't we seen these radar returns before? Why specifically on these two nights, exactly 1 week apart?" Samford's answer revealed the weakness of the entire explanation. Temperature inversions of unusual intensity occurred on both those nights. The specific meteorological conditions required to produce these radar effects are relatively rare. That they occurred twice in such a short period is certainly unusual, but not impossible. The answer was technically possible, but statistically improbable. The skeptical reporters made notes. Major General Ramey addressed the interceptor incidents. "Our pilots performed admirably under confusing conditions. When vectored toward radar contacts that were actually temperature inversion effects, they naturally found nothing at those locations. The apparent evasion of the objects was simply the inversion effects dissipating or shifting as atmospheric conditions changed. But this explanation ignored Patterson's testimony about being surrounded by visible objects that appeared simultaneously on his radar. The press conference lasted over an hour, with Samford and his team deflecting, explaining, and reassuring. They emphasized that no threat to national security had been identified, that the Air Defense Command remained fully capable of protecting American airspace, and that further incidents would be investigated thoroughly but were expected to be similarly explainable. As the reporters filed out, the consensus was mixed. The official explanation provided a plausible, scientific-sounding answer that many newspapers would report faithfully. But the more skeptical journalists recognized the gaps, the inconsistencies, the way certain questions had been artfully dodged rather than directly answered. The New York Times would headline, "Air Force debunks saucers as natural phenomena," but smaller papers ran more skeptical stories. "Official explanation leaves questions unanswered." Behind the scenes, the military breathed a collective sigh of relief. Samford's performance had been masterful, providing enough explanation to satisfy the majority of the public while avoiding admissions that would have sparked genuine panic. The temperature inversion theory, despite its flaws, was the best available option. It was scientific, it referenced real phenomena, and it couldn't be definitively disproven without access to classified radar data and witness testimonies. But in the radar room at Washington National, Harry Barnes watched the press conference coverage with bitter disappointment. He'd witnessed the objects firsthand, tracked them for hours, watched them maneuver intelligently and evade interceptors. He knew what he'd seen wasn't weather, and he knew the military had just chosen convenient fiction over uncomfortable truth. Lieutenant Patterson, watching from his squadron ready room at Newcastle Air Force Base, felt the same betrayal. He'd been surrounded by 4 glowing objects that paced his aircraft perfectly. His radar operator had confirmed solid contacts. He'd seen them with his own eyes, close enough to describe their appearance in detail. And now senior officers were telling the nation it had been stars and temperature inversions. Captain Ruppelt, sitting in his Project Blue Book office, added the official press conference transcript to his file on the Washington incidents. Beneath it, he placed the radar plots, the pilot testimonies, the technical analyses that contradicted everything Samford had just told the American people. The file was marked unidentified. It would remain classified for decades, a testament to what really happened over Washington in the summer of 1952. The press conference had achieved its goal. Public anxiety began to subside. Congressional pressure eased. The story slowly faded from front pages, replaced by Korea, elections, and other concerns. But for those who'd been there, who'd witnessed the impossible firsthand, the official explanation changed nothing. They knew what they'd seen. and they knew the truth remained hidden. For decades, the official story remained unchallenged in government records. Temperature inversions, misidentified stars, and over-eager observers had created mass confusion over Washington in July 1952. Case closed. The files were sealed, marked classified, and buried in archives at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But in 1985, under pressure from the Freedom of Information Act, the Air Force began releasing previously classified documents related to the Washington incidents. What emerged told a dramatically different story than the one Major General Samford had presented to the American people. The first bombshell came from the radar operators themselves. Internal Air Force documents revealed that all three radar installations, Washington National, Andrews Air Force Base, and Bolling Air Force Base, had been inspected and calibrated immediately after the first incident on July 19th. Technical teams found all systems functioning perfectly, with no evidence of malfunction or miscalibration. More significantly, the maintenance logs showed that the radar equipment had been recently serviced and was operating within normal parameters throughout both incidents. Harry Barnes had submitted a detailed technical report to Project Blue Book immediately after the second weekend. The declassified version, released 33 years later, contradicted the official explanation point by point. Barnes wrote, "The targets displayed primary returns characteristic of solid objects, not the secondary returns typical of atmospheric phenomena. The targets demonstrated intelligent behavior, including formation flight, hovering over specific locations, and evasive action when approached by interceptors. In my professional judgment, based on 20 years of radar operation, these were not temperature inversion effects. Even more damning was the analysis from the radar technicians themselves. A classified technical evaluation conducted in August 1952 concluded, the radar returns observed on July 19-20 and July 26-27 displayed characteristics inconsistent with temperature inversion effects. Temperature inversions typically produce weak, fluctuating returns that drift slowly with atmospheric movement. The Washington targets showed strong, steady returns that executed rapid maneuvers including acceleration, deceleration, and directional changes suggesting active propulsion. This document had never been shown to the reporters at Samford's press conference. The meteorological data proved equally problematic for the official explanation. Declassified weather reports from both weekends showed that while temperature inversions were present in the Washington area, they were mild compared to inversions that had occurred dozens of times before and since, without producing any unusual radar returns. A National Weather Service analysis, commissioned by Project Blue Book but never released publicly, stated, the meteorological conditions on the nights in question were not exceptional. Similar or more pronounced temperature inversions occur regularly over Washington, particularly during summer months. The specific atmospheric conditions cited as causing the radar anomalies are insufficient to explain the observed phenomena. Lieutenant William Patterson's full testimony, classified for 33 years, revealed details that had been omitted from all public accounts. His written report described the four objects that surrounded his aircraft in precise technical language. Objects appeared as luminous spheres approximately 30 feet in diameter, glowing orange-white with no visible means of propulsion. They maintained perfect formation with my aircraft for approximately 3 minutes, matching speed and altitude precisely. My radar operator confirmed solid returns from all four objects simultaneously. When they departed, acceleration was instantaneous and departure vectors were coordinated, suggesting communication between the objects. In my professional opinion as a fighter pilot, with 800 flight hours, these were controlled craft of unknown origin. The CIA had also been monitoring the situation far more closely than publicly acknowledged. Declassified agency memoranda revealed deep concern at the highest levels. A memo dated July 28, 1952, addressed to Director of Central Intelligence Walter Beadle Smith, stated, the Washington incidents represent either a massive failure of our air defense system or evidence of aerial vehicles with capabilities far exceeding our technology. If Soviet, this represents the greatest intelligence failure since Pearl Harbor. If not Soviet, the implications are potentially more significant. Recommend immediate and comprehensive investigation beyond Project Blue Book's current capabilities. Perhaps most revealing were the internal Project Blue Book documents showing intense disagreement among investigators. Captain Ruppelt's private notes, released decades after his death, expressed frustration with the pressure to explain away the incidents. We have multiple radar confirmations, experienced pilot testimonies, visual sightings by trained observers, all corroborating the presence of unknown objects with extraordinary capabilities. The temperature inversion explanation does not adequately account for the totality of the evidence. We are being pressured to close this case with an explanation that satisfies political requirements rather than investigative standards. Major Dewey Fournette, who witnessed both incidents firsthand from the Washington National Tower, submitted his own classified report that remained sealed until 1985. Fournette wrote with the authority of direct observation, "I personally observed the radar returns for over 6 hours across both incidents. The targets demonstrated behavior inconsistent with any known atmospheric or equipment phenomenon. They executed intelligent maneuvers, avoided interceptors, and repeatedly positioned themselves over sensitive installations. The correlation between radar contacts and visual sightings by multiple independent observers eliminates the possibility of purely electronic or atmospheric effects. These were solid, controlled objects of unknown origin and capability." The most technically detailed analysis came from the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson. Their classified assessment, completed in September 1952, analyzed the object's calculated performance characteristics based on radar tracking data. The report concluded, objects displayed velocities ranging from HAVA to approximately 7,200 mph. Acceleration rates calculated at up to 9,000 mph in less than 2 seconds. Such acceleration would generate forces exceeding 90 Gs, which would be instantly fatal to any human pilot and would likely cause structural failure in any known aircraft. The objects executed right-angled turns at high velocity without apparent reduction in speed, a maneuver that violates known principles of inertial physics for any conventionally propelled vehicle. The radar data itself told the most compelling story. Declassified radar plots showed the object's flight paths in precise detail. The tracks revealed patterns that suggested systematic surveillance, regular orbits over the White House, Capitol and Pentagon, methodical coverage of Washington's restricted airspace, and coordinated movements, suggesting multiple objects operating under unified control. One analyst noted in the margins of a declassified plot, "This looks like a reconnaissance pattern, not random atmospheric effects." Visual sighting reports from commercial airline pilots, many of which had been classified and excluded from the public narrative, provided corroborating evidence. Captain William Bruin of Capital Airlines submitted a detailed written account. The objects appeared as solid discs, glowing orange-white, with no visible wings, engines, or conventional flight surfaces. They maintained formation, accelerated beyond any aircraft capability, and at one point paced my aircraft for several minutes. My co-pilot, flight engineer, and several passengers also observed the objects. These were not stars, not weather balloons, not atmospheric phenomena. They were craft of some kind, operating under intelligent control. Even ground observers provided testimony that contradicted the official explanation. Air Force security personnel at Andrews Air Force Base submitted reports describing objects hovering at low altitude, close enough to observe structural details. One security officer wrote, "Object appeared disc-shaped, approximately 60 feet in diameter, hovering at approximately 1,000 feet altitude. Surface appeared metallic, glowing with orange luminescence. Object maintained position for approximately 5 minutes before accelerating vertically and disappearing from sight in less than 2 seconds. No sound was audible at any time. The statistical analysis was perhaps most damning. A classified study examined the probability that the combination of radar contacts, visual sightings, and interceptor encounters could all result from misidentification and atmospheric effects. The conclusion: the probability that all observed phenomena can be explained by the combination of temperature inversion, equipment malfunction, and misidentification of astronomical objects is less than 0.01%. The correlation between multiple independent observation methods indicates a high probability of solid, Maneuvering objects present in Washington airspace during the reported timeframes. What the declassified files revealed was a pattern of institutional denial. The evidence overwhelmingly supported the presence of unknown objects with extraordinary capabilities. Multiple independent observation systems, trained professional observers, and technical analysis all pointed to the same conclusion. Yet the official explanation dismissed all of this in favor of a theory that the military's own experts knew was inadequate. The documents showed that the truth had been known all along. The military understood that something genuinely unexplained had violated Washington's airspace. They knew the temperature inversion explanation was insufficient. They knew the witnesses were credible and the evidence was compelling. But acknowledging the truth would have required admitting either that Soviet technology had rendered American air defenses obsolete or that something even more extraordinary was operating in American skies. Neither admission was politically acceptable in 1952, and so the convenient lie became the official truth, while the real evidence was sealed away for decades. By the time these documents were finally released, the witnesses were old men, the urgency had faded, and the Washington incidents had become historical curiosa rather than active mysteries. But the files proved what Harry Barnes, Lieutenant Patterson, and Captain Ruppelt had known all along: something real, solid, and unexplained had owned the skies over Washington in July 1952. And the government had chosen to hide that truth rather than confront its implications. The Washington incidents of July 1952 sent shockwaves through the military establishment that reverberated for decades. Within weeks of the second encounter, the Pentagon implemented sweeping changes to how UFO reports were handled, investigated, and, most importantly, controlled. On August 26, 1952, barely a month after the incidents, the Air Force issued new regulations that would fundamentally alter how unknown aerial phenomena were addressed. Air Force Regulation 202, released that summer, established strict protocols for reporting and investigating UFO sightings. More significantly, it included provisions that effectively muzzled military personnel. Section 7 stated, Air Force personnel will not discuss UFO reports with the public or the press. All inquiries will be referred to the Public Information Office. Violation could result in court-martial under espionage laws. The regulation transformed UFO reporting from open scientific inquiry into classified intelligence matter. The message was clear. What happened over Washington would not be allowed to happen again. Not because the objects wouldn't return, but because information about them would be strictly contained. Project Blue Book, which had operated with relative transparency under Captain Ruppelt, was reorganized and brought under tighter control. Ruppelt, frustrated by the increasing pressure to explain away rather than investigate genuinely puzzling cases, resigned in 1953. His successors were chosen for their willingness to toe the official line. By 1955, Blue Book had transformed from an investigative program into what critics called a public relations operation, designed to debunk UFO reports rather than objectively analyze them. The CIA, deeply concerned about the national security implications, convened the Robertson Panel in January 1953. This gathering of prominent scientists was tasked with assessing the UFO phenomenon and recommending government policy. The panel's classified conclusions, not fully released until decades later, recommended a program to debunk UFO reports and reduce public interest in the subject. The concern wasn't that UFOs were real, but that public fascination with them could be exploited by enemies to clog reporting channels or create panic. The Washington incidents had demonstrated how quickly UFO reports could dominate public attention and distract from real security concerns. For the men who'd witnessed the events firsthand, the legacy was more personal. Harry Barnes continued working as an air traffic controller, but he never stopped speaking about what he'd observed that July. In interviews over the subsequent decades, his story never changed. "I know what I saw on those radar scopes," he told a researcher in 1976. "Those were solid objects, intelligently controlled, performing maneuvers that shouldn't have been possible." The military knew it then, and they know it now. But they chose to lie about it, and I've had to live with that lie for 24 years. Lieutenant William Patterson, who'd been surrounded by 4 glowing objects. left active duty in 1956. He rarely spoke publicly about his experience, burned by the way his testimony had been dismissed and contradicted by senior officers. But in a 1986 interview, shortly before his death, he finally opened up. "I was there. I saw them. My radar operator confirmed them. They weren't stars, they weren't weather, they weren't anything conventional. The Air Force threw us under the bus to avoid admitting they had no idea what those things were. Every fighter pilot I knew who encountered them had the same experience. Real objects, extraordinary performance, and official denial." Captain Edward Ruppelt wrote a book about his Project Blue Book experiences in 1956, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. His account of the Washington incidents was carefully worded, walking the line between his observations and the official explanation. But in private correspondence released after his death in 1960, Ruppelt was more candid. "The Washington incidents were the most significant UFO events I investigated. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses impeccable, the documentation extensive, yet we were ordered to explain it away. That's when I knew Blue Book wasn't about finding truth. It was about managing public perception." The cultural impact of the Washington incidents extended far beyond military policy. They transformed UFO phenomena from fringe curiosity into mainstream concern. Before July 1952, flying saucers were dismissed by serious people as delusion or hoax. After Washington, the conversation changed. If unknown objects could hover over the White House with impunity, perhaps the subject deserved serious attention. The incident sparked a wave of UFO interest that dominated popular culture throughout the 1950s, influencing movies, television, literature, and public consciousness. More significantly, the Washington incidents established a template for how governments would handle UFO reports for generations. Acknowledge the reports, provide plausible conventional explanations, classify the compelling evidence, and move on. This pattern would repeat countless times over subsequent decades, each incident following the same script of initial concern, official investigation, and ultimately dismissive explanation. By the 1960s, the military had perfected the art of UFO debunking. Project Blue Book closed in 1969, with the Condon Report concluding that UFOs pose no national security threat and no scientific value. But the closure came only after Blue Book had successfully reduced UFO reports from urgent military concern to cultural joke. The transformation from the panic of 1952 to the dismissiveness of 1969 represented a triumph of information management over objective investigation, yet the questions raised by the Washington incidents never truly disappeared. In 1973, during the Watergate hearings, CIA Director James Schlesinger admitted the agency had taken UFO reports more seriously than publicly acknowledged. In 1985, when the first classified documents were released under the Freedom of Information Act, researchers discovered the vast gap between what the military knew and what they'd told the public. Each declassification revealed more evidence that the official explanations had been inadequate at best, deliberately misleading at worst. The modern era has seen a remarkable reversal. In 2017, the Pentagon acknowledged the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, a classified UFO investigation program that operated from 2007 to 2012. In 2020, the Department of Defense released Navy videos showing encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena, displaying flight characteristics similar to those reported over Washington in 1952, extreme acceleration, hypersonic velocities, and apparent defiance of known aerodynamics. In June 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a preliminary assessment on UFOs, now termed Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, or UAPs. The report acknowledged 144 encounters between military personnel and unknown objects between 2004 and 2021. Of these, the government could explain only one. The remaining 143 remained genuinely unidentified. The assessment noted that some objects demonstrated advanced technology and appeared to remain stationary in winds aloft, move against the wind, maneuver abruptly, or move at considerable speed, without discernible means of propulsion. The language was careful, bureaucratic, stripped of the panic that had characterized the Washington incidents. But the admission was significant. After 70 years of denial, the U.S. government was acknowledging that unknown objects with extraordinary capabilities regularly operated in American airspace, and that despite decades of technological advancement, they still had no explanation. Former military personnel who'd encountered UAPs during their service began speaking publicly, emboldened by the government's acknowledgement. Commander David Fravor, who encountered a tic-tac-shaped object during a 2004 training exercise, described performance characteristics identical to those reported over Washington in 1952. Instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic speeds, and no visible means of propulsion. The technology gap hadn't closed in 50 years. Whatever these objects were, they remained as far beyond human capability in 2020 as they had been in 1952. The Washington incidents of 1952 established another lasting legacy: institutional mistrust. The gap between what witnesses reported and what the government acknowledged created a credibility chasm that persists today. When the Pentagon releases UAP videos in 2020, many wonder what evidence remains classified. When officials acknowledge unexplained encounters, people remember the decades of denial and dismissal. The lie told in 1952 poisoned the well for all future government statements on the subject. For UFO researchers, the Washington incidents remain the gold standard of mass sighting events. Multiple radar installations, dozens of trained witnesses, military interceptors, extensive documentation, all occurring over the nation's capital under intense scrutiny. If these incidents could be officially dismissed as weather and misidentification, then any UFO report, no matter how compelling, could be explained away. The Washington incidents proved that evidence, witnesses, and documentation meant nothing against institutional determination to deny. Yet paradoxically, the incidents also proved that the phenomenon was real. The declassified files, the consistent witness testimonies maintained over decades, the technical analyses that contradicted official explanations, all demonstrated that something genuinely extraordinary had occurred. The government's very desperation to explain the incidents away suggested they knew the objects were real and were terrified of the implications. In 2012, on the 60th anniversary of the Washington incidents, a small group gathered at a memorial in Arlington National Cemetery. Among them were children and grandchildren of radar operators, pilots and controllers who'd witnessed the events. Harry Barnes had passed away in 1989, still insisting his testimony was accurate. Lieutenant Patterson died in 1987, having finally told his full story. Captain Ruppelt never lived to see the files declassified, but their descendants came together to honor the men who'd witnessed the impossible and had the courage to speak truth, despite official denial. At the ceremony, Patterson's son read from his father's final interview. "I spent my life defending American airspace. I was trained to identify threats, to react decisively to protect my country. That night over Washington, I encountered something that made all my training irrelevant. 4 objects surrounded my aircraft, demonstrating technology we couldn't match then and, from what I understand, still can't match now. The military chose to deny it rather than confront it. But I was there. I know what I saw, and the truth matters, even when it's inconvenient." The legacy of the Washington UFO incidents of 1952 is complex and contradictory. They prompted institutional reforms that increased secrecy. They sparked public interest that authorities spent decades trying to suppress. They generated compelling evidence that was classified for generations. They demonstrated both the reality of unexplained aerial phenomena and the government's determination to deny that reality. Most importantly, they established a question that remains unanswered 70 years later. What flew over Washington in July 1952? The objects displayed capabilities that still exceed human technology. They demonstrated awareness and intelligence. They came twice, exactly 1 week apart, as if conducting a systematic operation. And when American interceptors tried to engage them, they responded with what could only be described as contemptuous ease, demonstrating that the most powerful military on Earth was utterly outmatched. On clear summer nights in Washington, when aircraft pass overhead and radar scopes track the endless ballet of commercial traffic, old-timers in the control towers sometimes remember. They remember when the scopes showed something else, something that moved too fast and maneuvered too precisely to be conventional. They remember when the impossible came calling, hovering over the White House while the nation watched helplessly, and they remember that official denials don't change what really happened. The radar blips that Edward Nugent first laughed at on that July night in 1952 represented more than just unknown objects. They represented a challenge to humanity's understanding of its place in the universe, a demonstration of technological superiority that shattered illusions of human supremacy, and a mystery that governments chose to hide rather than confront. 7 decades later, the questions remain. The objects have never been adequately explained, and somewhere in classified files that may never be released, the full truth about what happened over Washington still waits to be told. The laughter died that summer night in 1952. It has never returned. And perhaps that silence, that gap between what was witnessed and what was acknowledged, is the most lasting legacy of all. Because it taught a hard lesson. Sometimes the most incredible truths are the ones we're least prepared to accept, and the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves when reality becomes too uncomfortable to confront. The Washington UFO incidents proved that truth can be suppressed but never destroyed. The files eventually declassified. The witnesses eventually spoke. And the questions, despite 70 years of official denial, refused to disappear. What flew over the White House in July 1952? We still don't know, but we know what it wasn't. It wasn't temperature inversions, it wasn't stars, and it wasn't mass hallucination. It was something real, something extraordinary, and something that still, after all these years, remains beyond our understanding.